He is my strength, my life, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, run through the fiercest darkness. Lights of love, the dance of peace, and cares are still, and silent sea. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. Who still confess, fullness of God in helpless way, the Spirit of God and righteousness, scorned by the ones He came to save. Good on that cross that He died, the Lamb of God was satisfied for every sin. On Him was laid, there in the death of Christ I live. In the ground, His body lay, light of the world, my darkness slain, and thirsting for glorious day, while from the grave He rose again, and as He stands in victory, earth has lost its grip on me, for I am His, and He is mine, from the precious blood of God. No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first hour to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever draw me from His hand. He returns. As we home, here in the power of Christ, power of heaven will be man, and never fall from His hand. He returns, for cause we home, here in the power of Christ.
Thank you so much to the praise band, and we'll be hearing more from them later today. Thank you to Chris for leading us in morning prayer. It's wonderful to start our day with that spirit of prayer and the wonderful scripture readings. So we're beginning session 1. I would invite anyone who is with Engage that they can follow. There's Julie, our lovely Engage leader. That's Julie Moser. And I also wanted to acknowledge Stephen, who is going to be helping lead, and Ken. He's already waiting there for you. So if you are going to the youth discipleship, the Engage portion, you can just follow those folks.
Please follow me, you will get lost.
And welcome to Bishop Greg too. We'll chat with him later, but it's great that you're here. Thank you so much. All right, so our first session here with ACA begins with Dr. Ron Kidd speaking to us, and I'll just give a little bit of an introduction. Dr. Ron Kidd is a professor of church history at Tyndale University in Toronto. His areas of specialization are patristics, renewal charismatic movements, pneumatology, ancient church of the East. Dr. Kidd has published 3 books and many scholarly articles. In his earlier years of ministry, Dr. Kidd founded Canada Pentecostal Church near Ottawa. He's now an ordained Anglican priest, and he most recently served as associate priest at St. Peter's Anglican Church, Cobourg, in the Diocese of Toronto. Dr. Kidd is famous in ACA, both for his intellect and his teaching and his pastoral nature, but also because of his wife, Dr. Roseanne Kidd, who faithfully and sacrificially led ACA for years. And she's still on the board, but she's certainly a mentor to me, and she probably gets way too many emails and texts from me asking her questions. I first met Dr. Ron Kidd many years ago, actually, as a young adult in the Pentecostal Church in Waterloo. I'm studying in Waterloo and attending church there, and that's my background. He was leading a young adults retreat, and he made such an impression on me. And I always kind of hoped to run into him again. And then over the years, after I ended up in the Anglican world, I hear people talking about Dr. Kidd. And I always wondered if they were one and the same. And sure enough, they were. I eventually got to meet him again. And they also made their way to the Anglican Church of Canada. So I'm so thankful to know you, Ron, and I'm so thankful you have come here today to share with us. I know these talks come of years of thought and scholarship, and we're simply looking forward to hearing you today. Welcome, Dr. Kidd.
I'm going to start off by confusing the situation. I'm going to go and get that music stand so that I can move closer to you, because as I speak, I want to see the whites of your eyes. Now, I preach from pulpits, but when I'm lecturing, I just like to get a little bit closer. So where am I? I'm in Calgary. I have a long history with Calgary. I haven't been here very long, but my first memory of Calgary comes from a time when I was probably 11 years old. I lived in Winnipeg. I was a strong supporter of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, of course, and I was just learning to enjoy football. So one Saturday, the Bombers were playing the Stampede, and I really wanted to hear the game broadcast. So I begged my mother if I could stay up late to listen to the game. So she eventually gave in and let me do that. So I was camped by the end of the kitchen table. She had wrapped me up in a blanket so I wouldn't get cold. I had my plasticine in my hand and I was playing with it. I still play with it. Nonetheless, I was playing with this and I was listening to the game. Well, about an hour and a half later, Mom came back into the kitchen to see how I was making out. And she looked at me and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah." The Bombers were losing and I was crying. and so that image kind of just lodged in my mind as I think of Calgary. Nonetheless, I'm going to be speaking a couple of times here this weekend, and I have given an overarching title to what I'm going to be saying, and it is there any good news in interesting times? You know, there's that old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Incidentally, it's not Chinese at all. It was first uttered in the House of Commons in the United Kingdom in 1936, and somehow it's been foisted off on the Chinese and they get a version. But be that as it may. So I'm using that phrase, and I'm doing that because we most certainly are living in very interesting times. I mean, there are things going on that are hard to imagine. You know, just in the socio-political world, we have the NAFTA treaty that was negotiated. You remember the difficulties of that. There was Brexit that the Brits are dealing with. Pipelines are in the news. Carbon tax is in the news. I mean, there's all of these things going on, you know, in our world that are forcing us to think about where things are going. And of course, there's technology, and technology touches us all profoundly, and there's every indication that technology is going to touch us much more deeply than it does. And it certainly makes it very clear to me how much the world has changed. Forgive me if I refer to my childhood once again, but I do remember very clearly one evening on a farm in Saskatchewan, when where we lived, and my mother picked me up in her arms, and she took me out into the pitch blackness of night, no moon, everything else. And I'm thinking, what? Well, I don't know what I was thinking, but I expect I was thinking, what's going on here? And all of a sudden, there was the sun. Well, it wasn't the sun, it was a yard light. The folks had just had electricity brought into the farm, and the yard light was going to be the first one. And they flipped the switch, and there was the light. So that's where I start. But now I'm emailing people in China, Switzerland, Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. So, technology is here, it's growing, it's going to touch us more and more deeply. And, we can be aware of that, and I'm going to be referring to that later on. So we're living in interesting times. And these interesting times are very significant for the church. And when I refer to the church, I'm going to be referring to the church very general. I'm not looking specifically at the Anglican Church. I will from time to time, but I'm looking at Christianity generally, not only Canadian, but broader than that. But you'll be able to follow it along as we go. The idea that I'm exploring here is in what ways do these interesting times serve as challenges to the church? So I want us to look at that. And I have given titles to the two sessions we're going to be spending together. I admit they're pretty corny, but a bit of cynicism crept in there. And so, we're looking at our little worlds, first of all, and then at our little selves. And so we launch into the first of those. And in fact, it is probably okay to talk about our little worlds. I mean, everything in the world is as close as the phones in our hands. And so, we're living in the back pockets of the Africans, et cetera, and they in ours. And so, what I want to do is look at the way in which the world, first of all, the way in which the world is impacting the church. And it's very important for us to start here, because historically speaking and practically speaking, we really can't understand any feature of a culture or a society at any time until we contextualize it, until we put it in the setting in which the events that's going on in it are involved. And so I want to look at the church, and I'm going to be focusing upon the church very fully. But we need to see the church in the context of the world in which we're living. And so I guess the reason that is prompting me for this is that, the changes that are occurring in the society and in the churches are quite dramatic. And these changes have consequences, very profound and very far-reaching consequences. So I want to start off by highlighting some of these changes, and then looking at the impact the changes are having on the churches. And so we'll start with looking at some of the changes. And when we do that, I'm looking first of all at the socioeconomic developments that have taken place over the last 100 or so years, maybe a little longer. As you probably know, the Industrial Revolution erupted in the US and the UK and spread across Europe and on into the rest of the world from there. There is an organization that was created in, I think it was 1974. It's called the World Economic Forum, and it meets in Davos, Switzerland. If you follow the news, I expect you have heard from year to year of the meeting in Davos that has gathered. And what this organization does is attempt to bring together the movers and the shakers of the globe. And they have this very interesting objective, and that is to make life better around the globe. Well, don't hold your breath. But nonetheless, so they gather in politicians, they gather academics, they gather entertainers, they gather anybody who seems to be having an influence on the way in which the society is moving. And a couple of years ago, what they came away with was the idea that, in fact, the Industrial Revolution has gone through about 4 revolutions. The first, they said, was in 1789. This was the steam engine, the use of water, mechanical production equipment. The second one was in 1870, and this had to do with the use of electricity and the division of labor, mass production. The third of these industrial revolutions was in 1969. You know, that's a bit shocking when I realize how old I was in 1969. Anyway, okay. A lot of you guys have the same problem or the challenge, nonetheless. And so in 1969, they point to the electronics, to IT, to automated production, and so on. But there is a fourth. And the fourth, they put a question mark on it. They're not saying when it's going to start or when it started. And it's the cyber physical systems. And so what they're doing there is looking at robotics and AI and trying to understand the implications that all of that has. And if you're interested in these sort of things, you should really try to read this article. It comes out of The Economist. It was published on September the 26th, 2018. The author is a fascinating guy. And this guy's name is Yuval Harari. Have you heard that name, Yuval Harari? You better have. And you're going to be hearing more about him both here, but otherwise. And so what he's doing in this article is talking about the implications of the development of technology as it applies to industry and life as a whole. So all of these things have been going on. And there are people who have been reflecting on it, obviously, one of whom is Thomas Homer Dixon. Thomas Homer Dixon is at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at and also at the University of Waterloo. He's the kind of a guy, an academic, who gets invited to the conference in Davos. He's known as a thought leader. And so one of the things that he said in talking about the kinds of things we're reflecting on is that there are an amazing number of quantitative changes that have been going on. And he comments, and I'm quoting, "Humankind is entering a fundamentally new world." And that's quite a statement, a fundamentally new world. Now, you and I have figured out how to navigate in the world in which we're living. But what Homer Dixon is saying here, the world in which we're living is actually changing. Now, we know it is, but it's changing profoundly and it's changing rapidly. And so how are we going to cope with this? And so what does this world look like? Well, it's interesting to think about that. And so we can acknowledge immediately some positive features, and I want to do that. When I say positive features, I'm talking about the improvements in medical care. I'm talking about the possible improvements in education that are taking place in various parts of the world. I'm talking about the attempts to move toward an equality of understanding and perception between human sexes. I'm talking about the relative peace that the world has had. In fact, there hasn't been a world war for 73 years. I mean, there are all kinds of wars going on where people are fighting through proxies, and you know the stories. But nonetheless, there has been a widespread era of peace that we have enjoyed. So there are many things that are a part of our world that are to be applauded. And we live where we live. And we ought to be thanking God for the privilege that we have to live where we live, to receive the benefits of the world as it's unfolding. However, having said that, though that is not the generation, that's not the generalization that a lot of people that are looking at the world are coming to. Now, there are those who do, if you've read Steven Pinker and people like that. And when others have looked at the world, what they have seen increasingly is a growing consumer culture built around the individual. And I want to just pause and underline both of those components. A consumer culture built around the individual. Now, we live this and we feel it. Well, some of the people who have been talking about this would include Robert Belloc. He died a few years ago, an outstanding sociologist in Britain, and in the United States. And as he was reflecting on what was going on in the United States, what he said is the social basis of American culture is a world of bureaucratic consumer capitalism, which dominates or has penetrated most older local economic forms. Its center is the autonomous individual, presumed able to choose the roles he will play and the commitments he will make, not on the basis of higher truths, but according to the criterion of life effectiveness as the individual judges it. And so his assessment, having looked at American culture for decades and at some depth, is that it is a culture which is built around the assumption that each human person is in control of her or his life and is privileged to make all decisions for them, not by referring to any code book or the spiritual guide, but simply by looking at themselves. And so we're dealing with a highly individualistic culture, and we're dealing with a highly commercialized culture. And the story of all of that is one that you can imagine if you haven't reflected on it. You know, when the Americans in the late 18th, 19th century learned how effective they could be at producing products, they produced way too many products. People in America couldn't buy them fast enough. And so they started to develop an international framework so that their products could be sold abroad in many areas, and on and on and on. Well, they were the inspiration. And now the whole of the world is cranking out products in phenomenal qualities, with phenomenal qualities and in staggering numbers. And you and I have the responsibility of buying them so that they can keep making more of them and make more money. Well, of course, each of us as a human being has the ability to make the credible decisions that she or he wants in order to pull all of this off. And so that was an interesting, when I came across that was an interesting reflection on Bella's part. George Rawlik talked about this. George Rawlik was a history professor at the University of Queens, died regrettably a few years ago after a car accident. And he was reflecting on what was happening in Canada specifically. And what he was saying was, we have moved away from the social ideas of self-sacrifice and discipline. Moved away from that. And we have been overwhelmed by, and now I'm quoting, the narcissistic gospel of intense therapeutic self-realization. The narcissistic gospel of intense therapeutic self-realization. I invite you to think about that for a minute. And so, what we are all being encouraged to do is get some kind of care for whatever struggles we feel. It's a therapeutic world, and we are to launch onto those techniques or products which will help us in the best possible way, because we are the center of the universe, each of us individually. And so this is this narcissistic gospel. Well, I could go on almost indefinitely. Homer Dixon, coming back to him, he says some interesting things along the way. That the technologies that save us time and labor individually, that empowers each of us, bind us collectively into a frantic, mad race in which we often feel more caged by obligations and demands than before. Anybody identify with that? I mean, I sure do. And so we've got all of these abilities to have contact with an endless number of people. And the emails keep flowing in. I mean, I'm almost afraid to go home after this weekend because there's going to be 100 emails in that inbox, and I'm going to have to deal with them. And it's wonderful to be in touch with all these people, right? It's just you want to brush your teeth every now and then too, but there isn't time. You're dealing with so many things that are going on. And a little later, in another place, he picks up this idea of consumption, and he tries to understand addictive buying. The consumerism helps anesthetize us against the dread produced by empty lives that modern capitalism and consumerism have themselves helped to empty of meaning. And I'll let him conclude by saying, as he talks to the technological process that we're all aware of, our raison d'etre of miracle machines are gods as they become our gods. I want you to listen to this. We may begin to think that we, as the creators of these machines, are gods ourselves. Now that's a bizarre idea. If we're creating all of these machines that can do all of these fantastic things, we can step back and admire them and reap the benefit of what they do. But he's saying we run the risk of starting to think that people who can produce these marvelous machines must have extraordinary abilities. They must be gods themselves. Well, it's actually happened, ladies and gentlemen. It's actually happened. I referred to Yuval Noah Harari, this paper. Well, this guy has written 3 books in the last few years. Homo Sapien, a brief history of mankind, 2014. It has sold 8 million copies. The next book, Homo Deus, a brief history of tomorrow. This guy's a historian, but a cheeky historian. A brief history of tomorrow, published in 2016. 4 million copies sold. And he's got another book out, and I haven't had the nerve to buy it yet. 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, published this year. And his articles are showing up in all of the major journals and the largest newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, and so on and so on. And in Homo Deus, fascinating book. I thought of bringing it, but it's so heavy I didn't want to bring it on the plane. But here's this big fat book in which he analyzes the world, and he gives us a picture of the whole world. And what he's doing in this book is imagining an alternative meta-narrative. So a meta-narrative is the big picture. And so, people develop meta-narratives in order to understand what's going on. And so what Harari does here is imagine an alternative meta-narrative to the one that has existed ever since there has been humanity until today. Now, if that isn't cheek, I don't know what is. But, he's publishing selling all these books, and people are thinking it's important. And basically what he says is, there is no reality beyond the senses. So science, which we have created, will help us look at the world, and us specifically, individuals, as thoroughly as one can look. And what science doesn't see isn't. So, no mind, no soul, no God. All interesting ideas. And they all played their role. But insofar as refined and specific as our technologies are, science has not been able to find any of them. So sorry, folks, they're not there. Yeah. And actually what he does is affirm Friedrich Nietzsche. Back in 1982, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a charming little book called The Gay Science. And in one place in that book, he said, the madman came into the marketplace in the middle of the day, and he was carrying a lantern. And he was shouting, where is God? Where is God? And so the people began to laugh at him. And they said, why, is God gone on vacation? Maybe he's in the bathroom. Who knows where God is? Well, he's got an answer. The madman's got an answer. And the answer is, God is dead. We killed him. And aren't those churches monuments to God? Because God's dead. And how do we wash the blood off our hands? The blood of God. Because we are the people who killed God. Now, I don't think Nietzsche really cared if it was God or not. But what he was trying to say is, the supra-rational world doesn't mean anything anymore. Because what he saw in 19th century Germany was a socio-economic culture that was determined to eat itself to death and provide bags of money for the leaders of corporations so that everybody could have a great time. And it's all sensual. The church doesn't have anything to say. God doesn't have anything to say. God's gone. And then he says, the madman says, how could we have done it? If we could have killed God, then surely we must be God. And so if you remember the 1960s, and you probably do, it depends how old you were there, you might not remember if you were younger. But nonetheless, if you remember the 1960s, and the God is dead theological movement came along, and people were picking that phrase up out of Nietzsche and making hay of it. Well, Harari has read his Nietzsche. And he says, page 313, Homo Deus, Nietzsche was right. It's just taking a long time to get rid of the body. Nietzsche was right. God's dead. We just can't get rid of it. Can't move the body. And we have to do that. So from his point of view, no mind, no soul, no God. Science can't find any of them. Okay, so we all know that's incredibly bizarre. What a stupid twit. Well, 8 million books. I would suggest that this gentleman is having an impact. And so as we try to get a sense of what our world is, and what the dominant urges and impulses of our world are, then we have to look at this guy. And what we're looking at is a world. So we're in Canada, Western, great. But the influence of the Western world is global, as you know. And so it's a world which is increasingly narcissistic, the individuals in it. By the way, I should have spent time on this, but I flew out here on a plane. And I got on the plane and I sat down WestJet, lovely. And anyway, there was no screen on this back of the seat in front of me. And I'd seen that before. I said, oh, yeah, of course. Well, you know why, eh? Well, I'm making this up, I don't know why, but I think this is why. You see, they could only have X number of video presentations that they could pump through their screens. So now you go and you hook your device up to the system, and then you can get anything you want. So they're not going to cramp your style and say, you've got to watch this or you've got to look at this. You can choose what you want to look at. Why? Because You're God. Forget that. Anyway. So, we're living in this world that has changed phenomenally in the last 150 years. And the fascinating thing, or one of the fascinating things about that is, we have no idea what's coming next. So this guy, Harari, he makes some comments about what's coming, but thank goodness he's enough of a historian to say, this is not prophecy, and this isn't even a prediction. This is a probability of more or less strength. But he sees the way it's going. None of us know. Okay, so there have been tremendous changes in the last 150 or so years. So what I want to go on to is to spend a little while thinking about the impact of these changes upon the churches. So I'm using church generally here. I'm not just talking about Canadian churches. I'm not talking about just Anglican churches or evangelical churches, but churches generally. And if you haven't read Reg Bibby, you need to start reading him. He's a Canadian sociologist at the University of Lethbridge. Back as far back in the first book he published in 1987, which he entitled "Fragmented Gods," incidentally. He talked about, he drew conclusions from his research. And there was a phrase later in the book that really captured the whole thing. And that phrase was, culture leads, religion follows. Culture leads, religion follows. And he, of course, he was giving us a Canadian picture. But from the wider perspective, we see the same thing. Douglas Hall, emeritus professor at McGill, talked about what went on early in the 20th century. And what he basically said was that Christian groups looked around themselves and they saw the increasing industrialization and consumerization, if that's a word, that was going on in culture. And they noticed, what would they think now? And they noticed that fewer people were coming to church. We're talking before the First World War, and they got this sense that this could have negative consequences. And so what Hall said was that these people began to feel they had to do something in order, quote, to retain their hold on the culture. So in other words, they saw themselves as influencing culture in various ways, but they perceived that they were influencing culture less and less, and so they became anxious about how they could change themselves so that culture would not be offended by them, and people would keep on coming to church. Bibby says, they were afraid to lose their market share. And that's an interesting thought. So what Hall does is quote another guy. This is H. Richard Niebuhr. And he talks about exactly what was going on at this time. And he talks about a liberal softening of doctrine. In other words, dealing with doctrine so it's as inoffensive as possible. And one of the comments that Niebuhr said, about the theology, global Western theology of the early 20th century was, it reconciled God and man by deifying the latter and humanizing the former. That's an interesting thought. And the product, and again Hall quotes Niebuhr, the product was a God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. So in other words, what they're saying is the church began to look at what it was saying and said, crosses might not be a great idea. They could offend people. So how do we adjust this and play this down so that we can keep them actually coming? Jacques Ellul picked up some of this, picked up a lot of it. In a book written in 1986, what he said was, Christianity has become a religion of conformity, of integration into the social body. And he attributed a great deal of that integration and of that response on the part of the church to the growth of wealth in churches, generally speaking. John Mackenzie, a Catholic scholar, writing at about the same time, wrung his hands over the impact of wealth on the Catholic Church. And then he went on to say there is a deadly and irreconcilable opposition between Western civilization and Christianity, and one of them must destroy the other. Deadly and irreconcilable opposition between Western civilization and Christianity.
When was that?
1986. Coming back to Bibi. Religion, he says, instead of standing over against culture, has become a neatly packaged consumer item, taking its place among other commodities that can be bought or bypassed according to one's own consumption whims. So Christianity has been neutered. It's been shaped so that as few people can be upset by it as possible, but it's still around so that those who want it can have it. Now I want you to listen to something else. And then I'm going to ask you who said this. This picture of shopping for one's religion on the basis of its usefulness, as one shops for any well-advertised product, tends to weaken faith. For if religion is accepted for reasons other than its claim to absolute truth, then one denies that claim. Who do you think said that? Sorry? No. It was Pierre Bergen. Anybody remember Pierre Bergen? Yeah, sure. Pierre Bergen. It was he, in the book, The Comfortable Pew, written because the Anglican Church encouraged him to write the book and give them a sense of what was going on. And then he also says in that book, the church, in the last half of the 20th century, stands in danger of forgetting exactly what its message is. Now, when I first read that decades ago, I thought, I'm surprised that Burton had that much insight. And as I look back on it now, I'm really surprised because he's bang on. Quite fascinating. And the interesting thing is that what I'm describing now, I'm narrowing, or at least focusing a little bit. What I'm describing applies to the evangelical world in many ways as well. Evangelical groups both in and outside the mainstream church. And when I say mainstream, of course, I'm talking about the Anglican Church, the United Church, Presbyterian Church, and Lutheran Church. But one of these days we have to stop calling them the mainstream because they're in a little creek that is. Anyway, you get the point. Nonetheless, when we look at them, we look at evangelicals. The picture that emerges is not that exciting. Reg Bibby came up with a formula on the basis of his research. And he published this formula, talked about it in 1987, 92, 93, 2004. and he and I exchanged emails a month ago, and we still talking about it. And what he said was, there is a formula to help us understand evangelical growth. And the formula is 70%, 20%, 10%. 70%, 20%, 10%. So 70% of the growth of evangelical churches comes from other evangelicals leaving churches and coming there. 70% of the growth. 20% of the growth comes from the integration of children of evangelicals in various churches. So 90% of the growth comes from the circulation of the saints, was what the phrase that was used, and keeping the kids who grew up in evangelical homes. 1% comes from people from outside the evangelical family coming to the church. Now, who are those people? Well, you know who they are, right? They're United Church people. And they're evangelical Anglicans who can't handle it anymore. and they're, so all of that, and Vivi affirms this, all of that suggests that evangelicals are not doing a great job at reaching the lost. Now that's kind of interesting, because evangelical comes from the evangel, the gospel, and those of us who see ourselves as evangelicals are preaching the gospel. God must be asleep. The Holy Spirit is not convicting those people that we are touching. Okay, that's one explanation. I don't like that one very much. So what's happening here? Well, then there was another study published in 2011, and what this study did, it was done by the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and a couple of others. The title of the study was not very nice. A hemorrhaging faith. And so what they were doing was they were looking at the presence of youth within evangelical and non-evangelical churches, mainstream churches. And what they came up with, it's a long and detailed study, but what they came up with was, in terms of the loss of children who are brought up in various churches, out of 10 children who are brought up in the mainstream church, or a mainstream church, 9 are no longer attending church. 1 out of 10. In the evangelical churches, it is 4 out of 10. So those who grow up in an evangelical church, from among them, 6 are not attending church now, or at the time when the survey was taken. Well, that's kind of interesting. Good for us. We're 3 better than the other guys. Yeah, it's really great. So we have another question, and that is liturgy. Where does liturgy come from? Well, where does liturgy come from? Well, increasingly, liturgy is coming from the culture. It's not coming from the church. And what has been interesting for me, my background is a Pentecostalism. I was a Pentecostal for 40-some years, and now I'm into Anglicanism. And what I hear as I talk to friends all over the spectrum is that the evangelicals are nibbling away at liturgy from one end, and the liberals are nibbling away at the other end. So it's as though, we forgot what this stuff means. That means. These things speak. And what we're doing is dealing with them comparatively casually. More of that later. So we've got this issue, and the issue is churches face immense pressure from the wider culture to conform to that culture and to fit into it in the least offensive way possible. Now, that's not new. I mean, it's been happening as long as there's been a world. You know, the wider society exerts force upon everybody to conform. That's just the way it is. Back in 1970, a sociologist, Brian Wilson, in Britain, talked about some of this and pointed it all out in great detail. But, you know, if you think hard enough, you can see it happen. You know, there's social pressure to conform. And so we're facing that. And, you know, I would suggest that we're not doing really well. That the pressure of the society has been strong enough to make a lot of us, maybe unconsciously, make adjustments so we can fit in and be Christians too. And in fact, I have to say that I think the Anglican churches are particularly susceptible to social pressure. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because establishment is in the DNA of Anglicanism. You know what I mean by establishment? You know, the state church, you know, the Church of England. And so, you know, we've got a history. Well, there have been some interesting things historically in Canada. So Charles English shows up from the United States after the American Revolution, and he establishes the Church of England in Nova Scotia, and he gets the council that's ruling the settlement to make it the established church, the official church of Nova Scotia. It lasted for about 2 years because there were a lot of people there that weren't Church of England. You know, they were people coming up from the United States. So it didn't last, but he tried. And then when we come to Jacob Mountain, just a little later than Inglis, he became the Bishop of Quebec. And this guy had his hand in access to the highest levels of British government, and he was handsome and tall and all that stuff. Well, when he came to Quebec City, after the British had taken care of the political world there, when he came to Quebec City, what he tried, was on the council that ruled the colony, what he tried to do was make the church the established church of the colony. And he spent most of his life trying to do that and never succeeded. The British didn't let it happen. So along we come to John Strong. You may have heard of him. The venerable bishop of the Church of England in Ontario. And along came the breakup of the land and the clergy reserves. You remember they were distributing all the land. I think it was the Act of Quebec in 1774 or something. Don't look it up. Anyway, it was that said 1/7 of the land ought to be reserved for a Protestant denomination. And so when Strong became a bishop of Ontario, he decided that meant the Anglican Church. And so he began to assert as much pressure as possible to get that recognized and to recognize the establishment. Didn't work. So we can come up into the 20th century. I came across a fascinating book. You know, on my shelf, I've got this book of Winnipeg. I grew up in Winnipeg, Fort Saskatchewan, grew up in Winnipeg. And here's this book that was published on Winnipeg's 125th anniversary or something like that. And it's got all kinds of pictures in it. It's very interesting. Well, here is a picture of the Most Reverend Robert Mackler. You remember the name? He was the first primate of the Church of England in Canada. And the picture was not of him, but it was of his body lying in state in the legislature in Winnipeg. You know, with guards holding rifles around him and so on.
Now that didn't happen to anybody else but an Anglican bishop. And so, within Anglicanism, next time on Remembrance Day, have a look and see who's praying, at the memorial in Ottawa. There's a very good chance it'll be an Anglican. Well, what I'm saying is, we Anglicans are a part of a tradition that has been tied very closely to the wider culture. When I became an Anglican, this shocked me. I knew this, but it shocked me. There was this one guy in our church, marvelous man. He was this hard and that wide, and he was a baby. But he had been an entrepreneur and had made bags of money, and he had used that money to refurbish the windows of Canterbury Cathedral, and the Canterbury Cathedral loved him, and so he was this prominent Anglican. So one day he said, Ron, I want to take you out for dinner. I said, okay. And so where we go was to some hoity-toity club in downtown Toronto. And I forget the name of the club. I wish I could impress you by telling you. But here was this marvelous club. And so we went to this club, and I kind of looked around. And there was just money, everywhere. And just the whole mood of the place. Well, I walked away from that. Whew, wow. I never experienced that as a Pentecostal. Because here was an obvious connection between the elites and Anglicanism. And so, as we think about ourselves and things that are taking place in our church, we need to recognize that we may well be a little more susceptible to some of this than other churches are. Okay. It's very hard to resist the tug of the wider society. It is just very hard. And when I look at the last 100 to 150 years, I'm afraid I have to agree with some of the people I've been quoting that churches generally haven't done that well. They have become increasingly shaped by the sense of loss as culture has increasingly turned its back. The impact, I think, has been tremendous. And what we don't know is where things go from here. More about that later. Okay, shorter than I thought. So that's it. And any reactions? Any comments, observations, questions? Yes. Robert Bell. Yeah. The book was. What was the book? Habits of the Heart. Thank you. Great, that was the book. And it was re-edited and republished in about 2006, and he reaffirmed some of the ideas that he raised in the earlier issue. Yes?
So doesn't that place of Anglicanism as the Dispassionate Church also give a unique opportunity?
Yes.
That other churches don't?
Yes. There's I think that's absolutely true. And and if I could just expand on that for a moment. I'm talking just sort of emphasis on somewhere else. But I've been tracking Canadian church life, reaching right back to the first census in 1871. And it's been interesting to watch what has happened to various churches. And what I saw was that I was looking at the number of people there were per thousand of population. And the Anglican, I don't have the statistics on my fingertips, but that the highest point of Anglican influence in terms of numbers of people per thousand was in 1921. And since 1921, it's been going down. And that surprised me, knowing what went on in the 50s and all that sort of thing. But the census figures show that it keeps declining. Well, the last few, has shown the decline. It's great. And when I knew that before I became an Anglican, but when I found myself in the Anglican Church, frankly, I grieve at what I'm seeing. Because the Anglican Church has a unique niche. That's the way it is. A lot of the elites, etc., are not going to go to a Pentecostal church. Now, they're stupid, because Pentecostals aren't what they think they are. But nonetheless, they're not going to go there. And it was Garnsworthy, Bishop Garnsworthy, who said to Red Vivi a long time ago, when Anglicans stop attending, they just stop attending, they don't go someplace else. And I think that's right. And so as I see what's happening here is, I see a segment of society which is not being ministered to. And that's an interesting segment of society as well. It's a very powerful segment of society. And, their choice, but, they're not hearing the gospel. They're nice people. All former Anglicans. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's something that we need to pray about. Yes?
When I was at university, the Guild Christian Fellowship, the issue seemed to be fellow students. There is no God. Many decades later, the issue is multiplicity of personally formulated spiritualities.
Yes.
But comment on that in the light that God is dead.
Yep. Sure. Okay, very good. I think the problem that we have in looking at the religious life of any place, but Canada in particular, is how we define religion. Now, I've thought about this for a long time. I taught theology, and I struggle with some of these issues. So, what is a religion? Well, we assume that in a religion there is God, there is a church, there is a holy place. Well, that's not necessarily true. In Hinayana Buddhism, there's no God. There are temples, but there's no God. And as I have reflected on that over the years, the impression that I've come to is that we ought to be thinking about religion as that which holds ultimate influence over our lives. And so if we think about defining religion in those terms, then communism is a religion, and I'm not the only one who says that. Communism is a religion. Atheism is a religion. And so, the stuff that's going on in the House of Commons and in other places, well, for example, in Quebec, following the last provincial election, you've been hearing about it, I'm sure. Well, what they're saying is, we don't want anything representing those religions. Our religion is okay. The images we have are a little different. It's a cottage in Muskoka. It's a place somewhere in Florida, etc. Because what is happening is, humanism is the word that is attached to it often, is that Indeed, we become gods. And so if we wanted to put a name on a religion that worships us, we could call it humanism. And if we do that, then we understand. But the culture hasn't come that far yet. And so it wants to point at Islam and Christianity, etc. That's a religion. You guys just make a lot of trouble. We're okay. Wow, that needs to be reviewed. Yes.
My parents talk with joy of the time they heard during the Second World War. Sorry, no, that's fine. My parents talk with joy of the time during the Second World War when the National Socialists invaded Russia, and then when Pearl Harbor happened, because they realized as a small island, suddenly they had a chance that they were going to win in the end. Do you see the battles between Western civilization and the understandings that the Chinese have and the understandings in the Middle East as being the battles between the two big enemies of Christianity from which we will emerge like gophers after the asteroid has destroyed the dinosaurs?
Great Scott. Okay.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm really fascinated by China right now. In fact, the field of research that I'm most engaged in right now is Christianity in China before 1400, and it's intriguing. I've been there a couple of times looking at things. Anyway, where's China going? What we're often not as aware of as we should be is how dense Chinese penetration is in most of the world, as a matter of fact. But certainly in Africa and in Asia and increasingly in Europe. And what they're doing is not sending in soldiers, although I'm sure they're sending in spies. But what they're doing is making huge amounts of money available to European nations such as Greece to build infrastructure. And it's happening all across Africa and in many parts of Asia. You know about the One Belt, One Belt. Yeah, the Silk Road, the new Silk Road. So he's trying to help us all understand that the whole world would be better if there were effective means of transportation between China and Europe, primarily, but then we'll go beyond that. And we'll do it either by sea or by land. And in fact, it's in place, as you may not know. There is a train route that runs from China to London now, and we see that what the Chinese are trying to do is make sure that they have got the confidence and the cooperation of all of the former Soviet satellites along the way, so that those people don't make any trouble with getting the railroad through, so that they can expand the system. So they're doing this very effectively. But what they're doing is they are making the world increasingly dependent upon infrastructure that they're creating, and worse, increasingly dependent upon the money that the Chinese are loaning them in order to do all these things. And so that's going on now, and it goes on at more levels and in more places than I can ever imagine. Martin Jacques, if you've ever heard that name. If you haven't, this guy is a Brit, but he lives in China, down in China, and his analysis of China is really fascinating. So it's growing, but then you mentioned the Middle East, and the Middle East is, I don't know what's going on there. it's and so we're into inner Islam here, and you know the proxy wars and the direct wars that have gone on and are going on are primarily between Sunni and Shia and some of the other many sects that are related. So I'm not so sure about the East. You know, China is very interesting. And I think Jacques' book is entitled When China Rules the World. Charming title. But you know, he's pointing to this, and you know, there's certainly that effort going on. Anything? Sorry, yes.
Ron, John Bigelow Pritchard of the Diocese of Saskatoon. And thank you so much for the connection with establishment, because I think it is one of the reasons why as Anglicans we're very vulnerable to co-optation by the culture. But the other piece is our culture of deference towards our leadership structures. So once the rot gets into the minds and mouths of the clergy, and more especially the bishops, you know, most Anglican bishops have the kind of power that the Pope would envy in terms of their absolute control over their piece of geography. And I think that once it's there, then we haven't been encouraged to critique. My experience of the Canadian Church, which is one of the reasons why I left Britain so long ago, was because Canadians don't think theologically. They're not able to, so I'm looking and hoping that maybe in this conference I'm going to meet some of the articulate younger apologists for the Orthodox faith within the Anglican Church, but because I don't know that they exist, and I live in a world of despair, actually. So anyway, I think that those two things together, establishment, the culture of deference, and our lack of critical theological skills, open us wide up to all this stuff. So thank you so much for what you said.
Yeah. Well, I'm retired, Dave. Okay. So I can talk about bishops. But no, he's not here. I was aware of that. But no, I think that's true. I mean, I think that the episcopal structure, from time immemorial, has been able, or has been an institution that has been able to justify and support a lot of control. I really think that's true. And you know, what kind of, I'll say more about the theological thought after the break. But I think you're right. You know, I think there is a tremendous need for you know, some very sharp intellectual work. Regrettably, the number of places in which that can happen are getting fewer. You know, the seminaries are dwindling. Trinity College in downtown Toronto, I think they still have the theological faculty, but I don't know, but very few people. I mean, Wycliffe is doing very well. But, you know, Wycliffe is under pressure. My wife's a trustee on the board. Yeah, you're right. Wycliffe is under pressure. And so, you know, how does, see, one of the I talked to multi-denomination, but one of the pressures that they all feel is financial. I mean, how do we pay the bills? Well, in both cases, you know, hallelujah, they were in the black at the end of last year, and you know, that's good. And you know, they are praying toward pressures. One more, yes, and yes.
Alan Gay from,
Sorry, Alan Gay.
From Yoga here in Calgary. I really agree with what Bob's kind of question said about the lack of ability to articulate theological. Potentially just making that, what we just been saying about the church really is responding to cultural social pressure. And I'm seeing that in the front line, the same problem with people outside the church. They can't articulate theologically what they believe, and they really struggle. Yes. But what I do hear them saying quite often on the front lines of I'm spiritual, but not religious.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, how do you respond to that? What if someone says that to you? How do you engage with that kind of nebulous term? They have some spiritual understanding, but they shun religion.
Yes, I've had that sense. And, I guess what I responded is, good. I'm glad you're spiritual. But can we talk? And, to try to take the conversation beyond that. So what do you mean? What does spirituality mean to you? And then, attempt to affirm and question issues that come up. But yeah, that is so prominent. 40% of the population, both by Angus Reid and Reg Libby, 40% of the population are people who have not affirmed religion and not denied religion. They're there, right in the middle. And that's where you find those kinds of comments in surveys that indicate, yes, I'm spiritual. I'm going to get around to this actually. So what do we do with that? And just the idea. I mean, I remember when I first read Bibby, where he talked about this 70-20-10 thing. And I thought, that's crazy. So much energy is being expended by us as a job. And nothing's happening. Virtually nothing is happening. What do we do with that? And that's become a source of anxiety ever since. Well, thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. It's time for the washroom and coffee. So we'll take a break.
Thank you. Is my mic off? Yes, it is. Well, I can say what I really think.